We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make CapTimes Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Epic. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Good afternoon. I'm Chris Murphy, Managing Editor of the CapTimes, and thank you for coming to CapTimes Idea Fest today. We're so glad to have had you here, and I hope you've enjoyed the talks today. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time, about the legacy of racial violence in America and in Wisconsin. I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Angela Fitzgerald, in just a bit, but I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for being here and for watching. We really appreciate it, and if you're looking for further ways to support the CapTimes, I hope you'll consider becoming a member if you aren't already. You can find more information about that at membership.captimes.com. Two bits of housekeeping before we get started. One is that you're welcome to submit questions to the panel, but please do so using comment cards that our volunteers have here and that they'll give to you, and they'll bring those up to Angela to work in as time permits. The second thing is I wanted to make sure all of you knew that immediately after this session, there's a reception that you're all welcome to attend outside on the front steps of the Wisconsin Historical Society, which is just across Langdon Street from us here at the Union. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Angela, who's a host and producer at PBS Wisconsin, which gets our special thanks for putting this session together. Angela is the creator, producer, and host of the Why Race Matters series. She's dedicated her extensive education and career to leadership, community engagement, and creating opportunities for others. Please give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can you all hear us all right? We're new to speaking through mass, so if we need to, ump our volume, then please let us know. But thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon, spending part of what is a lovely afternoon, a Saturday afternoon with us, to discuss a very important topic that unfortunately is not new. And so recently there have been tons of headlines about racial violence and reconciliation and what does that mean moving forward and where does justice sit within that conversation. And so today we have a lovely, esteemed group of panelists that are going to have a discussion about the series Unresolved Wisconsin, a dialogue on racial violence. And so to get us started, I would love to hand it over to Erica Howard for her to provide her introduction to us.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's really a pleasure to see you all here, especially on such a beautiful Saturday and in the midst of a pandemic. It's good that we can try and gather in forums like this one to talk about really important topics, and that's largely what I do as an impact producer at Frontline. Years ago, my position did not exist. We primarily showed documentary films about what's happening here domestically and internationally, very vital issues that the public need to know about. But our executive producer had the vision of bringing our films out into the greater public to engage with audiences in very meaningful ways and to have conversations about subject matters that people really care deeply about and can thoughtfully engage in. And so I produce public programming, both online and in person when we can these days. But it's all to, we're not an organization where we have the headlines of what's happening exactly here and now. We actually connect the dots and bring context, greater context and understanding about all these important issues and feel that it's important for people to be able to gather and discuss them. So that's part of what I bring to Frontline.
Thank you so much for being here today, Erica, and for your introduction. We'll now hand it over to Denise.
Good afternoon. It's a great honor to be here on a beautiful day in Wisconsin. My name is Denise Jackson Ford. I am the daughter of the late Worley Jackson Sr., who was a civil rights activist in Natchez, Mississippi. I am a retired school administrator, executive administrator. I do work part-time. It's only myself and my brother that's left. Everyone in my family is deceased now. But again, it's an honor to be in the midst of this great series that's fitting to happen.
Thank you so much for your introduction,
I'll pass it to
Denise. And now, last but certainly not least, Brad.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brad Lichtenstein, and it's also a great pleasure to be here. It's especially a great pleasure to be sitting next to Denise, who I've known now for 6 years, maybe going on 6 years.
Yeah.
It says up there that I'm the founder of 371 Productions, which is a production company, but more importantly, I'm a filmmaker, and with my colleague Yoruba Richin, who directed the film American Reckoning, the two of us have told the story of Denise's father, and our focus has been both on the case, on the murder that happened of Willis Jackson Sr. by racist white men who were members of the Klan, as well as an investigation into what the local law enforcement, the Department of Justice, and the FBI did back then in 1967 when he was murdered in '68, and then when the bill was passed called the Emmett Till Act that reopened these cases. And the film tells that whole story, and it also tells the story of black self-defense. So often when we talk about the civil rights movement, we think about the nonviolent civil rights movement inspired by Mahatma Gandhi and practiced by Martin Luther King. But throughout America, and especially in the South, and certainly in Natchez, there were groups like the Deacons for Defense, which Denise's father was a supporter of and worked with, that ensured that there was a way to fight back against white terror. And so our film also brings that story out to sort of disrupt the myth or the narrative that most people think about with the civil rights movement.
Thank you for that, Brad. And I understand that there's a way for viewers to interact and engage with us, those who aren't physically here in person. And so, Erica, would you like to speak to that a bit before we transition to a clip?
Sure, just share a little bit more holistically in terms of the overall project and what Brad has mentioned. This project, Unresolved, is one that is of really ambitious and greater scope than we normally have pursued with our work, where we work hard to produce films, but with this particular project, we decided to make it multi-platform and to make it accessible in different ways that people want to engage with content. And it's available as a web interactive where you can go on our website and delve more deeply into different stories, including Willis Jackson's story. And also, it's a serialized podcast. We've created an augmented reality installation that is touring currently in different museums around the country. And then ultimately, we'll have Brad's film that will be broadcast on Frontline in the fall.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that rundown.
And I just want to say, Brad and Yoruba's film.
Exactly.
I'm sorry
Brad and
Yoruba couldn't
Yoruba
be with us.
Yeah, it's important to give credit where credit is due. So are we ready for our first clip?
I think so.
Okay.
Who do we point to? First clip. And this first clip is about the overall project.
My name is Damara Shagalu, and I'm a filmmaker and creative technologist. And I'm also the creative director of Auto Pictures, which is a studio focusing on film and new and immersive media. We've been collaborating with Frontline on a really significant and socially relevant project called Unresolved. Unresolved is a multi-platform experience. It's composed of a podcast, a film, and I've been responsible for the interactive web experience and the traveling augmented reality installation. When designing this project, I was really inspired by looking at the role of the tree as a symbol in American history and the ability to design an experience that mixes art and technology with powerful investigative journalism to bring to life the stories of victims of racially motivated murders. Now here's a preview of Unresolved.
All I can do is just hear my mama calling Jackson, Jackson, Jackson. I heard her got abducted and beat to death, and nobody has ever been tried for it.
Mr. Speaker, the time has come. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of these crimes that were never brought to justice. There are murders who have walked free for decades while the families of victims cried for justice. Passing this bill is the least we can do, and we must do something to right these wrongs.
When we think of family trees, we look at it as a connector between generations, but also there's the dark history of trees and the associations with racial terror in American history. And I wanted to kind of reclaim that, to turn these into beautiful spaces.
FBI, the Department of Justice, somebody knows something.
In later years, I asked questions about what happened because
I wanted to allow audiences to participate in the memorializing of these individuals who lost their lives tragically.
Roman Ducksworth Jr.
By exploring the different chapters and the stories of these individuals, the audience member actually literally acts as a source of light to the experience. Often when we talk about the civil rights era or racially motivated murders, it feels like it's something from another time. I think that using technology to bring it to the now and also have it exist in a physical space is something really powerful. The way that I've designed the experience, you have to say the name of the person in order to be able to access their story,
Herbert Lee,
and learn about their cases and hear from their next of kin.
Very respectful.
And the idea is that all 151 names are surrounding us.
If people forget who we are, as they have in the past, we'll remind you, because we are going to be here. We're always going to be here.
I really truly believe in the depths of my soul that if we're going to have peace, if we're going to have healing, everything must come out. We must tell the whole story, the complete story.
Wow, that trailer was powerful. I don't know how you all in the audience felt. I'm seeing some head nods. Right, so I want to direct it back to our panel around, can you tell us the significance of not just the content, but it also being made available in a multi-platform sort of format, like the accessibility and the experience being available through multiple domains, like the significance of that. If you could elaborate more on that, as well as just some more background about the work and the significance.
Do you want to take the interactive part?
Sure. One of the things that we have discovered is that a good number of young people feel a bit disconnected from civil rights history, feeling that it's happened maybe 100 years ago, not realizing that it was, half a decade ago. Like 50 years ago. And that there are many people who are part of that period who are still with us. And wanting to reach younger people with this history, with this knowledge, we felt that one of the best ways to do it is to speak their language. A lot of what they're doing is digital. We have, of course, other generations who are on digital as well, but really wanting to make it accessible to young people, to speak to them and help them to have an understanding that this is not something that's far off, that it is to be understood as a more public history that's affecting us here and now. So in the project, there are over 150 people who are listed on the cold case list, which is derived from the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act, in which former our late Congressman John Lewis had gone before Congress and had commissioned for the Department of Justice to go in and to reopen these cases. And essentially, a lot of these people are unknown to the average person, that we wanted to take them out of being cold case number 1 or cold case number 50, and to work in such a way to bring the interactive to young people and to the greater public, to have an understanding that there is a life that was lived behind that number, that to work with the families and have them share narratives about who these people were, to recognize them in the fullness of their humanity, what they meant to their families, what they meant to their communities. And in allowing it to happen with an interactive, you become immersed in their stories. So one of the features of the interactive is that in order to learn about that person's story, you have to say their name. So you go online, and their story will come up, and the name will appear, but you have to say their name several times before the interactive opens up, and then you enter into their story. And it's very similar to what we experience now, what we see experience now as we hear the names of Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd, that people are remembering the way in which these people are loved and embraced and cherished by their families and their communities. And their names are known, but for that list, we wanted other names to be known and to also be respected, and to have people have a greater understanding of the fact that if you can imagine a constellation of stars and the beauty of those stars and what it is when stars are taken away, that's how it feels when a life is taken, that the beauty and the radiance of that life is taken, and that we need to recognize that and to take time with that. So with the web interactive, it does allow people to become more immersed and to engage in a much more thoughtful and empathetic way to learn who these people are.
Wow, thank you for that, Erica. And I love the star metaphor that you use, because it's exactly that. The significance of a life being lost isn't something that should be overlooked. Absolutely. So Brad, can you elaborate a bit on Yoruba's work and what the film sets out to do?
Sure. So just a little bit of the origin story. Back in, I think it was 2014, origin story, I had the great pleasure to work for Congressman Lewis when I was a kid, when I was 15. And so had a relationship with him. And in something like 2014, there was a conversation I had about maybe making a film about an incident in which a former Klan member had asked Mr. Lewis for forgiveness. And we started to have that conversation. And someone in his office, who's actually in the film, his press secretary said to me, you know, you might want to turn your attention to the cold cases, because Mr. Lewis was the sponsor of the Emmett Till Act. And so that's where we sort of pivoted. And actually, maybe Denise can help me tell the story, because then I found out about Orlis Jackson, and I went down to Natchez. And do you remember when we first met? Not like the date, but do you remember what that was like, or that experience of having me show up at your place?
Right, yeah, you came by the house and you introduced yourself, of course, and you told, you shared with us that you wanted to remake, I'm using the word remake, but help, get the story out about my father. And of course, once we, I think you also told us about something you had previously done, and my sister and I went back and looked at it, and she said, okay, we're going to go for it, so yes.
So that was the story of how this began, and the filmmaking is about relationships, and a lot of what Erica spoke about in terms of trying to remind people about the humanity that's behind a name or a martyr, and also, for that matter, the anger and hate that's behind these crimes as well, and to try to breathe life into this and make it real for audiences 50 years later was a big part of the motivation to make this movie. And then I'll just say briefly, because she's not here, but Yoruba Richin is an amazing filmmaker and a friend of mine. And we literally bumped into each other at Sundance in 2016. 17. And like many films, it takes a long time to make a film. So I said, how would you feel about joining me in the making of this film? And Yoruba's big influence on the film has been the discovery that the Deacons for Defense, while they weren't started in Natchez, they accomplished a great deal in Natchez. You literally have about 11 men who became so legendary in the minds of the Klan that they were able to squash a lot of the violence just by their reputation. And they also protected protesters in one of the most successful economic boycotts of the white power structure ever. In fact, the boycott in Natchez became the model for boycotts all over Mississippi. So the fusion of our two, interests and brains around this has created this film that is both investigatory but also celebratory in the sense of what resistance looked like in these untold stories.
Okay, so I'm so eager to get into these next. I think we have 2 more clips to view, and also, Denise, want to hear more about your story and the personal connection to this work. And so for our producing team, if we could maybe cue up the opener and the John Lewis visit, and then we can have your story on the back end, or would you like to introduce your story before we show the clip of John Lewis visiting your family?
What's your preference?
It's up to you.
Well, the day that John Lewis came to my home, it was a very touching situation for him to show up, not knowing that he worked with Dr. Martin Luther King, and Dr. Martin Luther King sent him to Natchez back during the 60s, back in '67, to find out what was going on after my father was bombed. So, and he gave me hope, not that justice was going to be served, but then the fact that he was there to stand up for justice and to help us to move forward with our lives. And he was concerned about the family. And I used to tell my children, I said, when they were talking at his funeral and he was saying about the family in Mississippi, I said he was talking about us. I said, because he sacrificed his life to come down to Mississippi to help solve or to help see what was going on back then. And then he thought enough of us to care enough of us to come to check on us in his latter years, after 52 years at that time. So, it's been 53 years since we lost my father, and no justice have been served. The only justice that I've received is the comfort knowing that I'm at peace with the situation. My mother's gone, and she left here not knowing, what happened. She not knowing that no one ever served time for the killing of my father. And when I even told her about the death certificate, I say, Mom, did you realize that on his death certificate they said it was an accident? I say, how can you call a bomb an accident? And she was like, are you for, yes. Back then, you're going to say that you bombed someone and it was an accident. But anyway, through it all, God has kept me. People, they say women don't tell age, but I'm almost 65 now, and I thank God for the 65 years that he has blessed me to be on this land. And I lost my father at the age of 9. The road has not been easy, but it's been bearable. Good times, bad times, but I thank God that we still have the family time. Yes. And I thank God for introducing us to Brad, Dr. Paula Johnson, Dr. Janice McDonald. They have been in our lives and helped us to try to get the story out about my father. A lot of people didn't know that, Worlis Jackson was my father. Right here in Natchez, Mississippi, they said, oh, I didn't know you was Worlis's daughter, but yes, I am. I'm the daughter of the late Worlis Jackson, and that's where I get my strength from.
Wow. Thank you so much, Denise. Beautiful. So can we now show the opening? We saw the trailer already, so the opening of American Reckoning, and then also the clip of John Lewis's visit to Denise's family.
Can we, just before we roll the opening, just for context so that people know, because I don't think we mentioned it, that Willis Jackson, your dad, was also instrumental in starting back up the NAACP in Natchez. So that's important to know.
Thank you for that.
Nearly 1,000 Negroes are marching silently through the center of Natchez, protesting the bomb-slaying Monday night of civil rights leader Wallace Jackson.
Come this side.
This community loved my father, and I love him. Is there any stronger word than that?
People that can really tell you about my father, what really happened and who should have been held accountable, the ones that are still living are afraid to talk. So will we ever get justice?
They've been killing us here for 400 years.
Right.
It's got to come to a head, and we're sick and tired of that. We done built this country.
There's this sanitized narrative about black history.
The sooner the white people realize that we aren't going nowhere, the better it's going to be for all of us.
And resistance usually are not a part of it.
Negroes are not going to accept this any longer.
To keep these national myths going because they don't want to have anything that might make white people uncomfortable.
Wake up, white people, before it's too late.
But the truth needs to be told.
I believe we have one more clip of the visit to Denise's family.
All right, Denise Ford.
Good to see you. Good to see Ms. Ford. How you doing? I'm John Lewis. Hi, how you doing? Good to see you.
I gave up a lot of times in my life that no one would be brought to justice, but then someone comes along and give you a hope.
I know what you have been through. Some of us will not rest until we find closure, find some answers.
Let me ask you a question. What more, just for our case, we see after 50 years, a lot of these people are dead.
Yeah.
So how can we bring closure? How can we, what can we do through this bill?
Well, we need to continue to investigate, because there could be family members of some of the people who committed these unbelievable acts of violence, still living, walking around every single day. They didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, they looked the other way.
I work right beside of one of the KK members' daughter-in-law. I'm quite sure that someone knows something.
Yeah.
And for them to not have come forth after all these years, it's unbearable.
To hang in there. I think they have to come forward. People who know something.
So we're going to transition to audience questions. I don't know if there's a microphone or some other mechanism that we can use to collect those just so everyone can hear them. But while we're teeing that up, I do want to come back to our panelists and ask, if there's any takeaways that you would like those viewing the project, but also sitting here and hearing this conversation to take away personally from this work. And I ask that because being in the state of Wisconsin and in the Midwest, it might be easy for some of us to feel as though we're removed from these issues because we're not in the Deep South. So what is the question in some people's minds may be, what is the application for us here? But of course, we know the disparities here aren't that different, right, from other parts of the country. So just wanted to put that out there to you all as we are preparing for audience questions. Well, for anyone who'd like to jump in.
You want to go first?
I can, even though it's been 50 years, and on the clip that you all just saw, my sister asked John Lewis if there was any such justice, a life for a life. And I can sit on the stage today and say that she had a son that was incarcerated for life. And she was mostly concerned about the son that she had that was incarcerated for life. In May of this year, he was exonerated. So he's out living his life, remarried, and with, you know, that's a justice right there for us and for my family. Even though they're not here to see it, just to know that her son is out, and the question that she asked Congressman Lewis, it has been answered. My dad, people always say they don't care about what Wallace Jackson did. You know, it's a hurting something to hear the younger generation say they don't care about what happened 50 years ago. Even though it happened 50 years ago, it's still happening every day in a different form of violence. But until we as a person, despite the color of our skin, the color, despite the cities or the state that we live, until we start recognizing what's happening amongst our young children, our middle-aged children, they still need to know that this is not an act that of crimes that should be gone unnoticed. The police department, people need to be held accountable for the crimes or the injustice that they're doing to us as individuals. And I'm sorry, I'm just lost for words, but anyway, we just need to be held accountable for our crimes, our situations, or the choices that we make, and not let things go unnoticed here in the United States of America.
Thank you for that, Denise.
I was going to build on that theme. I think the thing that we kept noticing, you see it's a work in progress. We're still making the film. We have 5 more weeks to finish it.
Oh, wow.
But the thing we keep noticing is how, you know, there's this eternal recurrence of the same, that we're a lot of the same exact phrases that we hear today when we talk about George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or any of these murders are the same phrases that we're finding in archival footage. And we were really blessed in the sense that there's a filmmaker who was in Natchez in the years leading up to the bombing making a film. It was called Black Natchez. And we got access to that film and also to all of his outtakes. And then the day after the bombing, he returned and started filming. So he I think, filmed for 7 or 8 weeks down there right after. That's how we're able to tell a lot of the story in real time. And, you know, you heard in the intro, the man at Wallace Jackson's funeral say, you know, they've been killing us for 400 years. And then you hear, wake up, white people. And I think that's one of the key takeaways, is that white people haven't woken up, and that this reign of white terror and white supremacy continues, and we see it every single day. So I hope the film, you know, as Denise said, gives a kind of context that helps people understand that our history is with us all the time. I mean, until there's real freedom, that history is with us all the time.
And I think,
thank you for that, Brad. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I think I just add to both Denise and Brad were speaking about. especially as you've heard Denise share. It's been very powerful this afternoon. And it is definitely reflective of what we were looking to try and convey throughout the course of the entire project, from the interactive to the podcast to the installation and now the film, is to centralize the voices of families, because for a large part they have been unheard and not even fully understood. I think many of us have probably seen pictures from funeral scenes, such as from Medgar Evers, where we see Myrlie Evers and her children, or we see Coretta Scott King and her children, and we see them embracing each other and crying, but not really fully understanding the depth of their loss and not fully empathizing with what they had to live through in that tragic moment and all the years after, where so many people did not receive courtroom justice, where in this project, it's not just the presentation of content, it's also investigation of our justice system, investigation of us as a society. A lot of what we found in the investigation was that the cases were cold for a number of reasons, whether it was statute of limitations or double jeopardy, where an all-white jury declared a suspect was innocent, and then you can't try that person again when there's clear evidence that that person was the culprit. Or there's even a lack of federal jurisdiction, where if a murder happened in a location that was outside of their scope of investigation, or so many years had passed that witnesses had died, or the person who committed the crime had died. In it, we present the stories of the people who were lost, but also that investigation of what was done when we were held with the responsibility, I'd say collectively, and also the Department of Justice, of trying to bring people to be held to account. And unfortunately, there's not going to be that courtroom justice, but we hope that for so many, but we hope that in the retelling of the stories, that there is this sense of bringing a wholeness to who we are as a nation, and to not look at this as something that is just a part of African American history, but this is collectively American history, that we all have a part to play. That we all have a part to play, whether it's from accountability, but also allyship, of taking a look at how do we go forward from this? How do we really come about going onto this pathway of healing and restoration? And so that charge is not to be left to someone who's elected to office or appointed to office, but all of us here and beyond. That responsibility is on us. And also just the fact that with this type of work, we want it to feel as though everyone has a part to play, that everyone can see themselves in this story, as maybe racial violence is more of a concept, but we all have a part to play in terms of the progress that we can bring to our society. And so we're hoping that this journalism, the way it's presented, the voices of family members who are helping us to remember and to recognize their lost loved ones in the fullness of who they are, will create something that will be impactful and hopefully transformational.
Thank you for that, Erica. And thank you for those of you who submitted some questions. This first one I'm going to volley to you all actually builds or connects nicely to the point that you just made about accountability. Well, that's the theme overall, but especially the political nature of what that could be and who we might be pulling out of that conversation. So this comment says, and excuse me if I'm trying to read handwritings here. So, hope is the last thing to be lost. Considering your family's history to endure discrimination at its worst, how do you build up resilience, inner strength, and feed hope to today's youth? That's one question. And then, what forces are currently in place that are moving political leaders and policy to increase accountability of civilians and law enforcement involved with cases against people of color? So that is to anyone who would like to offer a response.
Sounds like you should go for the first one.
Accountability.
Or resilience.
I can read it again if you want me to. Okay. So, considering your family's history to endure discrimination at its worst, how do you build up resilience, inner strength, and feed hope to today's youth?
Inner strength comes from, I had you know, we all been in the world at one time of our lives, but I had a mother and a grandmother that taught us after they decided to give up the streets, and I'm gonna use the word streets because we all, you know, this age. But anyway, when they gave up that street life and decided to understand what the true meaning of serving a just God, they started teaching us, and we started, you know, I'm always been one to just sit around and start watching or observing people, and I just, you know, I've observed my mother, my grandmother, and watched how my mother raised the 5 children that was left in her care after, you know, she lost her husband. She taught us how we have to pray and ask God to forgive, you know. And I learned how to forgive. I don't forget, but I learned how to forgive. And I learned how to put my trust in God, because I know that in due time, that justice is going to be served. If it's not served in a courtroom, it's served in a higher place than on this earth. So that's where my inner strength comes from, is knowing that I serve a just God. If God can't fix it, then man can't fix it for me. So that's my piece.
Thank you for that, Denise. Brad or Erica, do either one of you have anything you want to add to that question?
I could just add a little thing, I think, around what I've observed with your family, and then, if I may have permission.
You have permission.
And then say something about the accountability. You know, we had the pleasure of getting to know, obviously, Denise and her brother, Warlist Jr., and her late sister, Deborah, and to see the way each of them has processed this trauma, this pain. And you'll see it in the film. And for Denise, you know, as you said, I think part of that has been like seeking closure, especially through being able to commemorate her dad's life by organizing the forces to put up a marker in the spot where it happened. One of the things that Warless Jr. has really struggled with is how to process that trauma. And he's not alone. I mean, there are Black children of victims of violence who are dealing with the same kind of trauma he's dealing with all over this country now, today. And one of the things that Deborah really dealt with, and it wasn't just the bombing, but also the situation with her son, is an anger that made her you know, travel through the world with a burden around how she felt about white people. And you see her talk about that in the film as well. And I think that points to one of the things that is a question in the film, which is, what is justice? And that's what ties into accountability. Accountability in terms of putting people in prison for the crimes is one kind of justice. But there's a bigger question of justice. Especially when you have $10 million to $13 million a year times 10, which is what the Emmett Till Act was supposed to spend on this. You know, it begs this question around reparation and what could have been done with these resources to treat trauma, to, you know, create parity and equity in, you know, the places where that has not existed for a long time. So one of the things around accountability that comes up in the film is that the Department of Justice, believe it or not, never spent this money. Never spent this money. There was a lot of fanfare around the Emmett Till Act. One of Emmett Till's relatives herself wishes they could take the name off of it. She says that in the podcast. Nobody knows where the money went. We've asked everyone. It's part of the podcast. There's a whole part of the podcast that goes into this. We spend a little bit of time trying to account for the money. So you start to realize that there's individual racism that results in hate crimes. And there's also, this is the embodiment of institutional racism. When, you know, something as large as America's Department of Justice fails to spend the money and also to really bring anyone to account. The cases that were prosecuted were really, to the FBI's credit, but also in cooperation with journalists, brought before the Emmett Till Act. So we really have to ask the question of whether we'll ever get accountability, and then that points to the now. That points to where will we be 50 years from now when we think about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Laquan McDonald and Ahmaud Arbery and so many other names. Where will we be with those cases 50 years from now if we don't learn?
And just to dovetail with what Brad was saying, which is absolutely accurate, that in the web interactive and the podcast, there are facts that get revealed that are very shocking. And as I was saying, it's not just the presentation of the content, it's also an investigation of what was done with the Till Act, what was done with this charge, and also the budgeting behind it, where there was a credit that was initially given to the Till Act about a case being brought to justice that really was taking place before the act was even passed. And there was, I think it was the Alabama district attorney who had been looking into Jimmy Lee Jackson's case. And through his work, there was a conviction that was brought, and that was considered a success. However, when he went back to actually receive a grant to have more funding to look into other cold cases, because surely that's not the only one in Alabama, he ran up against wall after wall after wall, not being able to receive any funding. And it was tragic. That
was the purpose of the act.
Exactly, exactly. And so this is something the public really doesn't have an understanding about, that this act that was actually put into effect to allow these investigations to go on for a span of a decade really yielded very little, unfortunately. And so if you can imagine the double trauma of a family being told sometimes very completely incorrect information or even lies about the last moments of their family member or their circumstances behind the case, then it's closed, and then years later reopen, and then it's closed again without little understanding of what exactly went into it. The project reveals to the public what were some of the steps taken or not taken as to what the final result was. And the whole project was really inspired by a journalist, Ida B. Wells, and her work as a journalist to bring to the public what was happening in terms of racial violence. And what you see from her time so long ago throughout now, it really has been the investigative journalists who have been very key in the bringing forth of justice. So there's this very famous quote that she has, is that the way to right the wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them. And so what you see is that when there's been this structural racism in place or a lack of political will or effort put into investigations, you have these journalists who at least want to have the truth revealed, and sometimes with families, that is what they want. It could be, I met a family member a couple of months ago where he understood there would be no one brought to a courtroom to receive a verdict of guilty for killing his father, but he said, I at least want the documents to be unredacted. I at least want the truth to be revealed. And that's something I think is very powerful and very needed, because as John Lewis had said, I mean, that's the only way that we can move forward. We have to know the whole story.
May I just call out a couple of names of those journalists real quick before we move on, because even long before I arrived at this in 2007, 2008, when the Till Act was just sort of gearing up, there were journalists who were toiling away on their own. Some people might know Jerry Mitchell because he was involved with the Byron Della Beckwith case, but also Stanley Nelson, who did the work on Denise's dad's case. He's in a little shop of 4 people at a newspaper in Concordia Parish, Louisiana, right across the river from Natchez. And in the case of Willis Jackson, unfortunately, the main perpetrator is dead and has been for a long time, but he's also cracked other cases. One that we're going to be doing a film about soon is about Frank Morris, also in that region. And he is the one who actually found the lead suspect and brought that person to the attention of the Department of Justice and the FBI. And I won't give away everything that happened in that case. Ben Greenberg, who now works with WGBH, is another person who was working on these cases for years. David Ridgen, a Canadian-based journalist as well, who helped solve the case of 2 men of the last name D and Moore who were killed in Mississippi. So it's really important to recognize how many journalists have been doing this work on their own and have had actually more success than the FBI, sadly.
Well, I guess that connects to our next question, and we'll see if we can get to our last one before our time is over today. But are there any plans that you all are aware of for examining the legacy of racially motivated crimes in Wisconsin, or any journalists in this state that might be looking into those instances to bring about justice?
Funny you should ask. My team is working on a film right now that's related to the Jacob Blake shooting, so in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and looking at the alleged and perhaps provable conspiracy between white supremacist groups and militias and law enforcement when it comes to creating the conditions for Kyle Rittenhouse to have shot 3 people and killed 2 people in the aftermath of the Jacob Blake shooting. So, yes.
Beautiful. So we should keep our eyes open for that at some point. Can you give us when it might be available?
Oh, man, it's a while off.
Okay. That's fine, just so we know. So we'll just keep an eye out for whenever that does become available. Okay, and so we have 2 more questions. One connects to our earlier topic around children, but the ask was, what should children in school learn about the history of Black resistance? But I would argue that's probably not just children. What should we all be learning about Black resistance? Because we all have not been taught a lot of things about Black history in America, so, and nationally or internationally, actually. So what should we all be learning about the history of Black resistance?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll just share that another part of this project is to reach young people in the classroom. So within Frontline, we are produced out of PBS station WGBH, and WGBH has a division that is part of PBS Learning Media. And so there's a team, educational team right now that is working to create curriculum for high school students. And in addition to that, to provide professional development trainings for teachers who find it very challenging to teach difficult history. And with that, it's our hope that young people will learn a more holistic kind of understanding of not only civil rights, but in terms of Black resistance throughout history. And it's been very oversimplified. Usually civil rights teaching is more of, I've heard it expressed as Rosa Parks sat down, Martin Luther King stood up, and then everyone had their rights, and then it moves on from there. And to really go more in depth and have a much greater understanding of the nuances, the hardships, the challenges, and the successes, and the still grappling with this notion of what do you do when you're faced with this systemic racism. And to do it in such a way that young people have an understanding that it's not, again, it's not just Black history, it's not just about those who are from the Black community, but it's about all of us. Mm-hmm. And so to make it as inclusive and multicultural as possible. And so I think with that understanding, that's when we can all collectively have stepped forward. I think there's a lot of sometimes there's a lot of questions that are put to the Black community of, well, how do we solve this and how do we go about that? But it's a much more a question for all of us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Can I just add that, and it's not just about Black resistance or armed resistance, but there's so much of our history that we don't really know that much about because of the way it's taught. And, filmmakers can only do so much, but my colleague Yoruba is right now in production on a film about Rosa Parks, who was a radical and who was supporting Black resistance movements and women's movements in Detroit and obviously in Alabama. So she's doing her part to help tell the story and bring it to kids.
Beautiful. Thank you both for that. And our last question for the evening, expanding upon the supports for families who have been victimized, what national organizations are available for families of crime victims of color, like the ones being addressed here?
I don't know of an actually established, organized group. It seems to me that the families come to know each other and support each other
In the past, again, Syracuse University, Dr. Paula Johnson, she works with she has a cold case initiative with the Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York, and back in 13, we met a lot of families that had been victimized, like we have, and just the support or to know that you're not in this alone, that other families have suffered. It was like it was a great gathering. It was a great support group, but as far as support from a medical person or group, it has never been done for us, because my mom used to say she didn't realize how in depth my brother was as far as the medical help that he needed, and she still said, I'm just sorry I never got any medical help for him, because she didn't realize that he was that mentally incapable, and until she passed away. So just like Brad said, today, had he been here, he'd have been crying, he'd have been broke down, probably, got up and walked out. The only reason why I cry, because, once I keep reliving the story, it hurts. But I ask God, to wipe these tears away, because I know that we have to move on as a family or as an individual. But as far as any organization that has offered or extended help to the families, is none.
And there should be.
And it should be, but it's none.
And I think that's what we talk about when we talk about reparations. People think we're talking about some just big pot of money, and it's not.
Money can't solve it.
There are movements in Chicago, in Evanston, in California. So, I think in answer to that question, it's about supporting those reparation movements to come together and really be able to provide resource for people who have had to suffer and deal without.
Absolutely. So thank you all so much for your time and your attention and your hearts towards this work. Can you remind us again of websites, social media handles that we should be following for those of us who want to continue to support beyond our hour today?
Sure. If you'd like to follow the project, you can go to frontline.org and also Google Unresolved together with that, and that will bring you to the microsite that's dedicated to this project that gives you information about the web interactive. You'll have access to the serialized podcast. You can also keep up with the tour of the augmented reality installation that is currently at the 2 Mississippi museums. And also, of course, when the broadcast for the film will come about, all that information is contained in that microsite. And then you can also sign up for a newsletter there to we frequently be able to get updates about what's happening, and hopefully, coming back to even this area and other areas that other people would be very interested in attending programs like this one.
Thank you for that, Erica. Brad or Denise, you all have any other sites or handles that we should be following to support?
I don't know if I have any more handles, but it looks like the film will be broadcast sometime in November, so look for that. But, I always say that with an asterisk.
Just in case. Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a hand. And thank you to our audience as well, and you all have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making IdeaFest 2021 a huge success.